Reading Kant is notoriously difficult. One reason for this difficulty is that he didn't have a word processor. He almost at one point lost his professorship because for a period of 11 years he barely published anything. At the beginning of this fallow period, he wrote to a friend that he was about to give birth to a, quote, critique of pure reason, end quote, by which he meant an examination of thinking that is pure in the sense of not being dependent upon perception, that is, sensation. But it wasn't until 11 years later that his critique of pure reason appeared. During this whole time, Kant took daily walks that were so regular that the citizens of Königsberg, now Russian Kaliningrad, where he lived and taught, set their watches by him. And he thought, and thought, and thought. And many of these thoughts he committed to paper. Then, when it looked as though he might lose his professorship because of his lack of productivity, he gathered his notes and threw them together quickly and without sufficient editing, put them into a vast work. Then, a few years later, he revised this, again using, with minimal editing, various notes written at random times and then thrown together. As a result, the text of Critique of Pure Reason, in its A and B versions, is repetitive and terms are often used sloppily and in different senses. Those who are used to 20th and 21st century clarity of exposition will be frustrated. This first of his three critiques, by far his most influential and important work, has a grand, impressive overall architecture. But when you get into the sections, they are often a repetitive, confusing, and on occasion confused pastiche of stuff thrown together under headings because they sort of fit there. Kant was a great genius, but we all need editors, don't we? However, that's not the biggest problem with reading Kant. The biggest problem is that he uses terms in German and in their corresponding translations into English in ways that we no longer do. We've already seen one example of this. Pure in Kant's title does not mean unsullied, the usual meaning we give to this word. It means not having to do with sense perceptions. Use of pure in the combined sense of uncorrupted / unsullied by sensual matters is an example of the infection of our language and other European languages by the Christian Church's antipathy for earthly experience, its contemptus mundi, and its unfortunate cleaving of the universe into a, quote, higher, end quote, spiritual world and a, quote, lower, end quote, physical one. So, in Kant, one encounters a lot of terms that are baffling. What does he mean by pure reasoning? Well, he means those aspects of our thinking that don't derive from, have their origins in sense perceptions. Such terms pile up, undefined or poorly defined, and used in special senses, and readers are left utterly confused. So, I've created this brief essay as an aid to those who are beginning their study of Kant, as a means for heading off at the start those confusions about terminology. In the course of clarifying those, I will introduce many of Kant's most important, most influential ideas. This guy was a philosopher of the first caliber, perhaps the greatest the world has known after my dog, Diogenes. Here are two more examples of Kant's confusing terminology. After his prefaces for the A and B versions and introductions, again for the A and B versions, Kant begins the critique of pure reason proper with something he calls the transcendental aesthetic. When we use the term transcendental, we usually have in mind something that goes beyond our ordinary sensory experience. So, for example, the American transcendentalists, people like Channing and Emerson, thought that we could sense in nature an underlying and unifying spirit the oversoul, Emerson called it. However, in encountering Kant, we should reserve the term transcendent instead for that meaning, that is, having to do with underlying ultimate realities. For by transcendental, Kant means something completely different. Kant, in fact, calls his philosophical system transcendental philosophy. So, what does he mean by that? Well, some philosophers before Kant, Locke and Hume most famously, thought that we got all our knowledge of the world from sense perception. Kant disagreed. He emphatically disagreed. He believed that while we cannot know the world as it is in itself, the noumenon, but only as it is perceived by us, phenomena, we depend upon certain features of our own minds in addition to sense perceptions in order to make sense of anything. Kant uses the term transcendental deduction to refer to his method, which is the procedure of figuring out what must be the case with regard to how our minds are structured, about how they work, in order for us to make sense of things in the ways that we actually and necessarily do. This is the key to Kant. Take time to make sure that you understand what was said there. Hear a little more about how Kant's transcendental deductions work. 1. We consider functions of the mind, things that our minds can do. 2. We distinguish in the contents of our thinking that which comes to us from the outside via our sense perceptions from that which doesn't exist in external phenomena, but that are brought to or imposed upon the understanding of phenomena by the mind itself. Kant came to this way of thinking on his encounter with Hume, who had notoriously claimed that we could not prove the existence of causation, of cause and effect, but only what we actually encounter, which is events preceding or following other events. It was this in Hume Kant wrote in his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that, quote, awakened, end quote, him. I freely admit, Kant wrote, that it was the remembrance of David Hume which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a completely different direction. Kant's insight was that if causation doesn't exist outside the mind, in phenomena, then it must be imposed upon phenomena by the mind, for humans see causation everywhere, and this was Kant's first transcendental deduction. 3. By this means, via transcendental deduction, Kant argues, we can figure out the structures imposed upon sensory experience by the mind. In short, we have asked, how must the mind be structured to function if it imposes on sensory experiences the characteristics that it does? A side note. Many years after Kant, the great American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, a superb logician, introduced the term abduction to describe such what must be the case if thinking. Deduction is when we decide what must be the case given X. So, from the premises that Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, we can deduce it must be the case that Socrates is mortal. Induction is when we generalize based on specific instances. This swan is white, that swan is white, therefore we generalize to the proposition that all swans are white, which turns out to be false. Induction is the primary means by which we understand the world, but it is notoriously fallible in this way. An example of abductive reasoning would be this. It's wet outside. Therefore, it must have rained. The term abduction wasn't available to Kant. It hadn't been invented yet. So he calls this procedure a transcendental deduction. It's actually an abduction. It's figuring out what must be the case with regard to our minds, given that we are able to do this and that with them. Another side note. Kant was usually a little too cavalier in cleaving the world into that which comes from the outside via sense perception and that which comes from the inside via structures in the mind. We also, of course, have a number of internal senses, such as thermoception, nociception, proprioception, and equilibrioception, though Kant would probably argue that these are brain-imposed structures on internal contingencies. Now, when we use the term aesthetic, we mean having to do with beauty. However, that's not how Kant uses it in the Critique of Pure Reason. He means instead having to do with our senses. This older use of the term aesthetic survives in our term anesthetized, which means not capable of sense perception because of sedation. So, to recap, a transcendental aesthetic is, for Kant, a study of what must be the case with regard to our minds for them to be able to make sense of sense perceptions. And in the transcendental aesthetic section of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant argues that time and space do not exist in things outside ourselves, in sense perceptions themselves, but are imposed upon the blooming variety of perceptions, the manifold, by the mind. Imagine that you had red glasses placed on you at birth and never saw the world except through these. You would not see things as they are, whatever that means. You would see red things. The world would seem red to you. Similarly, Kant argues, the mind imposes upon whatever is actually the case, which is unknowable, these aspects or features that are not to be found in the perceptions themselves, but rather in how the mind is structured to make sense of things, in space and in time. Now, initially, this conclusion of Kant's transcendental aesthetic might sound a little crazy to you. Surely space and time are absolute aspects of the world out there. But in the modern era, Einsteinian relativity has shown us that time, as we perceive it, is an illusion. More about that later. In fact, all times exist at all times. We only cognize time as passing. The past is gone, the future is not yet existing, and the present as the only reality because of how our minds are structured. At any moment, we happen to be limited to that moment in our perceptions. But just as Chicago doesn't stop existing when we travel to Boston, so yesterday doesn't stop existing when we travel to today. So, in light of what Einstein taught us and believed himself, Kant's notion that space and time are imposed upon reality by the mind, that these are matters of our own limited perspectives, doesn't sound so crazy after all, does it? After Kant, anything but perspectivism with regard to metaphysics, the study of what is, became clearly, obviously, impossible. That is, obviously, to people who have thought clearly about it. So, we have seen that one difficulty in reading Kant is that certain key terms that he uses, such as pure, transcendental, aesthetic, and deduction, mean different things now to us than they did as he used them. Another example is Kant's use of the term judgment. To us, a judgment is an evaluation. We judge the quality of a particular bedsheet based on its thread count, its material, its softness, its durability, and so on. For Kant, and for many other philosophers, judgment is a much broader term. A judgment is any act of thinking or reasoning about objects, according to Kant, or as Kant uses it. At one point in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant presents extremely proudly what he considers an exhaustive table of judgments, or types of reasoning, which he divides into 4 species: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. I'll give you a moment to look at this chart. Quantity, that is number, can be universal, as in all x is A, example, all grass is green. Particular, as in some x is A, example, some grass is green. Or singular, as in this x is A, this grass is green. Quality, that is extension, can be affirmative, for all x it is the case that the x is A, or negative, no x's are A, or infinite, for all x it is not the case that x is A. Relation or class membership can be categorical, x belongs to the category A, hypothetical, if x is A then x is B, or disjunctive, x is A or B. Modality, i.e. possibility or necessity, can be problematic. It is possible that an x is A, or asatoric, it is the case that x is A, or apodictic, x must be A. So there are these four kinds of judgments. According to Kant, the mind imposes automatically upon sense perceptions its structuring of perceptions in space and time. It also automatically imposes upon its judgments about sense perceptions concepts based on those judgments that are automatically performed by the mind in response to sense perceptions. By the way, Kant confusingly refers to sense perceptions as experienced by us as intuitions, whereas we use the term with a completely different meaning to refer to hunches, to that which we think we know without being fully sure of the reasons why we suspect it to be the case. So for us, an intuition might be, I don't trust that guy, I think he might be a snake, whereas for Kant, an intuition is simply an experienced manifold of perception. So, the mind automatically, according to Kant, imposes upon intuitions experiences of sense perceptions, both structuring in space and time, and what he calls categories or concepts derived from each of these types of judgments. Corresponding one-to-one to Kant's table of judgments is a table of categories, concepts imposed by the mind on experiences. So for the judgment quantity, there are the categories of unity, plurality, and totality. For the judgment quality, there are the categories of reality, negation, and limitation. For the judgment relation, there are the categories of inherence and subsistence, substance and accident, causality and dependence, cause and effect, and community, reciprocity or coexistence, that is simultaneity. For the judgment modality, there are the categories of possibility and impossibility, existence and non-existence, necessity and contingency. The categories are mind-born, mind-imposed concepts, according to Kant. It is important to note that in the normal course of events, the mind imposes these concepts on sensory experiences automatically. But how does this happen? How does the mind impose the categories on intuitions or sense perceptions? According to Kant, it does so by following built-in rules for how the mind works that he calls schemata. And these schemata are all rules for making judgments using the categories based on time. It does seem entirely possible that Kant meant to say that there are also rules based on space, but didn't work that out before publishing the Critique of Pure Reason. So, according to Kant, the mind comes up with the judgment that something is impossible by applying the category or concept of impossibility using a time-based schema that at no time does this thing occur. It comes up with the judgment that something is possible by applying the category or concept of possibility using a time-based schema that at some time this thing could occur. It comes up with the judgment that one thing causes another by noting that the one follows the other necessarily in time, and there is no time in which one occurs without the other following it. It applies the category of substance to that aspect of a thing that persists despite accidental changes that occur to a thing over time. It applies the category of community to things that occur together at one or more times, and so on for all the categories. The mind automatically applies time-based rules or schemata using the concepts that Kant refers to as categories in order to form automatic judgments that are our means for making sense, for thinking about experience. Whew! So there you have it, your basic intro to Kant. Here's why his thought so blows my mind. He anticipated by more than a couple hundred years the cognitive revolution in psychology, which is based on the idea that the mind is not a passive receptacle, but rather imposes structures on experience. So, for example, we now know that much of the grammar of languages is built in, is hardwired into human brains, and those brains interpret speech sounds based upon those internal mental structures and the processing that brains do. So, Noam Chomsky owes a great deal to Immanuel Kant. Not having a computer ready to hand, Kant didn't have available to him the concept of processing as an explanation for the structures that the mind imposes. But that the mind imposes structures, he grokked that. Now, here's a nifty takeaway from all this. Kant says that we cannot know reality as it is in itself, the noumenon. We can't know transcendent stuff with certainty, though we can know transcendental stuff by figuring out what must be the case about the mind if we do X and Y. So, here's an application. We look upon the world and everything seems to be caused, to be determined. But we cannot live, we cannot function without the concepts of our own freedom, and we necessarily act as though we were free agents. I decided to write this essay. You decide whether to read it or not. We hold people accountable when they attempt to overthrow an election, sometimes, because we think them responsible, for they did so of their own free will. How are we to reconcile the two, our observations of determinative causation in the world and our necessary de facto belief in our own free will, which we can't live without? Well, here's how from a Kantian perspective. What we perceive is ruled by the mind-imposed category of causation. But as with the fact of all times existing at all times, despite the fact that we perceive it as flowing, it must be the case that free will is the underlying reality and that the determined nature of everything is illusory. So, even though we cannot, Kant tells us no about transcendent matters, we can speculate about them, and those speculations can be more or less warranted, as is the speculation that somehow, in some way, that we don't understand, because we are still too ignorant or will never understand because of our lack of access to ultimate reality, we are free. I mean really free. More on that topic in later videos in this series on Christian existentialism. Just a quick note, you might be wondering why I have paused this series on Christian existentialism to do an episode on Immanuel Kant. Well, here's the reason. We're going to be using some of Kant's ideas in later talks in this series, so this episode is a bit of background so you'll understand what's going on in those later pieces. Please like and subscribe. Check out my other videos on this channel. And thank you for watching.